Imagine this, a man whose very name once struck terror into the hearts of monarchs across Europe, a man who commanded nations with the wave of his hand, who made kings tremble, who rewrote the very blueprint of war and state now reduced to a fading shadow, wasting away in an isolated stone villa battered by ocean winds. He wasn't just a general, he was a force of nature, a legend living in his own time. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the emperor of the French, the architect of empires, the self-crowned conqueror who had faced coalitions of kings and emerged triumphant, lay dying in obscurity, not on a battlefield, not in glory, but in a prison disguised as exile on the desolate British-controlled island of Saint Helena. He was thousands of miles from the world stage he had once dominated, and yet, even in his final days, surrounded by suspicious eyes and whispering walls, his death would become the most haunting unsolved mystery in modern history. What if everything we were told about how he died was a lie? They said it was stomach cancer. They said it was nature. Just another story with an ending. But fate doesn't make your fingernails fall off. Fate doesn't turn your vomit dark and sour or your skin an unnatural green. Fate doesn't blacken your insides as if something slow and venomous has been burning you from within. And fate certainly doesn't echo in the halls with the dying man's own whispered suspicion. They are killing me. Now picture the scene. The most feared man in modern European history, his power, his intellect, his sheer will that had shaped a continent confined to damp stone walls. He was surrounded not by friends but by enemies dressed as wardens, watched constantly, censored brutally, and stripped of the very identity that had made him immortal. His letters were intercepted, rewritten, or outright destroyed. His mail was delayed or denied. His access to the outside world, to news, to contact with his son, was carefully restricted. His food was monitored. His water tasted strange. His wine was often bitter. His body began to change not with age, but with something more disturbing: tremors, hair loss, unbearable stomach pain, and a creeping madness. The once vibrant spark behind those steel blue eyes faded into a haunted glaze, and the man who had once marched across Europe with thunder now shuffled like a ghost within his own villa. And yet, no alarm bells were ever rung. No one panicked. No one cried foul, because this wasn't a tragedy. It was an operation. This wasn't a death. This was an execution. Quiet, clinical, invisible. A death delivered not by blade or bullet but by teaspoons and glass goblets. It was arsenic, odorless, tasteless, patient, administered slowly, repeatedly, in careful doses, meant not to kill instantly, but to erase, to rot him from the inside while preserving the illusion of natural decline, because dead emperors don't rise again. And for the British, for the returning Bourbon monarchy of France, for the frightened aristocrats across Europe who had barely survived the earthquake of Napoleon's first reign, allowing even the possibility of his return was unacceptable. And so he was buried before he died, not in a literal coffin, but in the silence of isolation, in the cage of surveillance, in the slow strangulation of his spirit and health. Sir Hudson Lowe, the British governor of Saint Helena, is remembered in history books as the man tasked with overseeing Napoleon's exile. But many scholars, conspiracy theorists, and modern analysts argue that he was far more than a jailer. He was a silent executioner, a bureaucratic assassin. Lowe limited Napoleon's access to the few comforts he had. He delayed his requests for medical attention. He tampered with correspondence. He even refused to allow Napoleon to move to a more suitable climate for his health. There were whispers of secret orders unwritten, untraceable, delivered behind closed doors in London, ensure he never returns. And when Napoleon finally succumbed in 1821, the official story was swift and simple: stomach cancer. He was buried on Saint Helena, in an unmarked grave under British control. The world moved on, but some things refused to stay buried. In 1840, under immense political pressure and public outcry, the French were granted permission to return Napoleon's remains to Paris. What they found horrified them. The body was almost perfectly preserved. After 19 years in a humid grave, surrounded by the salty air of the South Atlantic, the emperor's features were still recognizable. His skin had barely aged. He looked, according to eyewitnesses, like a man asleep. Scientists later confirmed what some already suspected: arsenic, used in consistent doses over time, acts as a natural preservative. It prevents decay. It embalms. So began the unraveling of the official story. A lock of Napoleon's hair, preserved by his loyal followers and sealed in glass, was tested in Sweden in the 1960s using modern chemical analysis. The results were staggering. The hair contained levels of arsenic so high that no natural environmental source could explain it. These weren't trace amounts from old medicines or contaminated walls. These were lethal, sustained, deliberate doses, which begged the question: who did it? The suspects form a tangled web of motive and means. The British had the most immediate access, and the strongest motive. They couldn't afford a second Napoleonic resurrection, the restored Bourbon monarchy in France feared a return of revolutionary sentiment and the potential of another empire rising from the ashes. Even some in Napoleon's inner circle had potential motive, perhaps out of fear or ambition, or the cold calculus of politics. To them, as long as Napoleon lived, their fates were uncertain. Perhaps they thought they were preserving his legacy by ensuring he died a martyr, not a prisoner. And then there was Low, cold, methodical, by the book. But the book he followed may not have been the one history remembers. He isolated Napoleon more harshly than protocol required. He treated the former emperor as a threat rather than a man. Some argue that he was simply following orders too dark to write down, too final to speak aloud, orders that echoed from London's Parliament halls to the candlelit drawing rooms of post-revolutionary France. But even with the evidence, the arsenic, the suspicious symptoms, the preserved body, there was resistance. The official narrative held strong for over a century. It was more comfortable, more palatable. The idea that history's most enigmatic figure had simply succumbed to illness allowed the world to move on without looking too closely at its own reflection. But truth, like Napoleon's legacy, refuses to stay buried. Today, the debate still rages among historians, forensic experts, and political theorists. Some cling to the cancer theory, citing the possibility of hereditary illness and dismissing the arsenic findings as environmental contamination. Others dig deeper, connecting dots that span continents and decades. Napoleon's death becomes not just a historical question, but a mirror reflecting the terrifying possibility that even the greatest among us can be quietly erased and that history itself can be edited. Because if Napoleon, an emperor, a genius, a man who reshaped civilization, could be assassinated so subtly, so thoroughly, then what about the others? What other truths have been sanded down, smoothed over, replaced by polite lies? What other legends lie in shallow graves, victims not of violence, but of narrative? Napoleon's death was not just the end of a life, it was the beginning of a silence that stretched across generations. But the whispers have returned. They echo in laboratories, in documentaries, in dusty books and digital forums. They demand that we look again, that we question, that we confront the terrifying truth that sometimes the victors don't just write history, they erase it. And so, we end not with an answer, but with a question that should keep every truth seeker awake at night. If one of history's most powerful figures could be silenced with poison and buried beneath a lie, what else have we been told to believe? What else was never meant to be remembered?